We're here this afternoon to talk about the consequences of the Iraqi oil privatization and the supplemental bill. With me is Ms. Antonia Juhasz, who's with the Institute for Policy Studies. She has written a widely circulated op-ed piece about the privatization of oil and has done extensive studies in this area. Ms. Denise Lombard is with U.S. Labor Against the War, which is a coalition of labor groups who have been active in challenging the basis of the war itself. Today, the House of Representatives will consider yet another version of the Iraq war funding legislation. Not only will Congress give the President another blank check, this despite a Democratic majority, Congress will also, wittingly or not, participate in the blackmail of Iraqi oil. The benchmarks in today's war supplemental force the Iraqis to privatize their oil industry by demanding passage of the Iraqi Hydrocarbon Act. The war supplemental blocks over $1 billion in reconstruction funds if the Iraqis refuse to comply. This administration misled Congress into thinking that pending Iraqi legislation before their parliament is about fair distribution of oil revenues. In fact, except for 3 scant lines in this bill, which I will distribute to you, except for 3 scant lines, the entire 33-page hydrocarbon law creates a structure to facilitate the privatization of Iraq's oil, which means that the United States is pressuring Iraq to hand over its oil wealth to multinational oil corporations. The truth is that the Hydrocarbon Act will open Iraq's oil reserves to foreign investors, giving them, and not the Iraqi people, the ability to develop a large majority of Iraq's 80 known oil fields. The Iraq National Oil Company would maintain control over approximately 17 of those 80 oil fields. If this happens, Iraq will be the only country in the Middle East that does not maintain government control of its own oil industry. The wealth of Iraq, their rich oil resources, should remain in the hands of Iraq for the benefit of the Iraqi people. Now, you have to keep in mind that the United States, one of the top officials of our government, when he was head of Halliburton in 1999, said, by 2010 we'll need on the order of an additional 50 million barrels a day. Where's this oil going to come from? The Middle East, with 2/3 of the world's oil, and the lowest cost is still where the prize lies. And I'm saying that passage of any legislation that includes insisting on the Iraq government that they push the passage of a Hydrocarbon Act puts this Congress on record in promoting the privatization of Iraq's oil. Congress must stop all attempts by this administration to allow multinational oil companies to take over control of Iraq's oil resources. Now, the head of the Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions has said the general public in Iraq is totally convinced that Bush wants to rush the promulgation of the oil law. This is equivalent to blackmail, and it sends a strong message that the United States is not in Iraq to help the Iraqi people or defend democracy, but this war is solely about oil. I'd like to believe that this war has not been about oil. I'd like to believe that there was some kind of righteous cause connected to what we did, but I know better. And the proof is in the Hydrocarbon Act. I'm here to say that, here's a quote from a former Iraqi oil minister. Why would we let them, the international firms, have a share of the oil? Iraqis will say this is solid proof that Americans have staged the war because of this law. This is Issam al-Halabi, former Iraqi oil minister. This is as reported in the Christian Science Monitor last week. I'm here to say that there's another path that can be taken. And that path is part of H.R. 1234, a bill that I've written which would enable the war to end by Congress determining that no money will go for this war. We don't have to pass a bill telling the administration it must open up diplomatic relations with Syria and Iran, and moving in a direction where we put together an international peacekeeping and security force that would move in as our troops leave. And then we set the stage for real reconciliation that cannot come with the U.S. serving as an occupying army. We have a moral responsibility to the Iraqi people whose country we've ravaged with war. Congress must put a stop to the exploitation of Iraq and ensure the reconstruction of a nation now in shambles. And there is no way that this war will ever end. If Congress passes a bill that dictates to the government of Iraq that it must hand over the bulk of its oil resources to multinational oil corporations, this really is a pivotal moment, not only with respect to this war, but with respect to this government being able to rescue a shred of decency. Because at this moment, we're on the verge of moving in to plunder Iraq on behalf of multinational oil companies. And by any measure, plunder is a war crime.
I am Antonia Juhasz. I'm with the Institute for Policy Studies, and you have with you an opinion editorial that I wrote in the New York Times that also appeared in the International Herald Tribune discussing the details of the oil law. The most important point to make is that this is a law that originates within the Bush administration with tremendous input and support from U.S. oil corporations. The oil law originated in the early days of the planning for the war in Iraq, and the plan was very simple and quite literal: to transform Iraq from a nationalized oil system, which was essentially closed to U.S. oil corporations, to a privatized oil system fully open to U.S. multinational oil corporate control. The mechanism for doing this would be a piece of legislation that would transform Iraq's oil industry through policy. The policy is a draft oil law, first drafted in the United States State Department, first introduced in Iraq by Ayad Alawi, the interim Prime Minister of Iraq appointed by the Bush administration, who introduced the first version of the Iraq oil law. The Bush administration has not been shy about pushing this law in Iraq and trying to get successive Iraqi governments to pass it and to make it law. The president announced, when he announced the surge in January, that the oil law was one of his benchmarks, a benchmark for the Iraqi government. It had to pass this law. What the law does, again, open up at least 2/3 of Iraq's oil to private foreign corporate ownership, unprecedented in the Middle East, essentially unprecedented in any oil-rich countries in the world. Understandably, it has also received tremendous resistance from Iraqi parliamentarians and the Iraqi public and Iraqi oil workers. So the United States has had to continue to push and put pressure and put pressure. Condoleezza Rice has put pressure. Zalmay Khalilzad has put pressure. General Casey has put pressure. And now the United States Congress is considering adding to that pressure by making one of the benchmarks in the supplemental a benchmark for receipt of reconstruction aid, one of the most vital needs in Iraq, reconstruction, that this benchmark be passed, that the Iraqis pass this oil law now. The oil law is essentially only in the interests of U.S. multinational oil corporations and in the interests of those who wish to see this occupation continue. The contracts envisioned in the oil law, production sharing agreements, allow for 20 to 30-year contracts for foreign oil companies for ownership of Iraqi oil. That means that those oil companies would need security for 20 to 30 years. That means potentially a continued U.S. occupation. This is why I believe the Bush administration talks about a significantly continued occupation, and even some Democratic leaders talk about a continued occupation. It would be to maintain security for U.S. oil companies once the oil law is passed. Thus, the key to the U.S. moral obligation to Iraq is not to force them to change their oil infrastructure to meet our needs. It is to allow the Iraqis the time, the opportunity to decide how they want, if they want to transform their oil industry, if they want foreign investment, on what terms do they want foreign investment, by whom, for how long, in what mechanism will generate stability in Iraq, which this oil law absolutely will not, and in what form will generate fairness in Iraq and economic development in Iraq, which this bill absolutely will not. The key to ending the war is ending the push for the oil law, ending the push for the benchmark, and I thank you very much, and again thank the Congressman for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you very much, Antonia Juhasz. Next we'll hear from Denise Lombard of U.S. Labor Against the Law. Thank you for being here, Denise.
Hi, my name is Denise Lombard, and I'm a member of the Office and Professional Employees Union, and I'm speaking here today representing U.S. Labor Against the War, a national coalition of more than 150 labor organizations representing more than 4 million union members. And we call for an end to the war and immediate withdrawal of troops. I would also like to thank Congressman Kucinich for his invitation today and also his exceptional leadership, not only against the war, but against this oil law. The origination of this oil law, as Antonia said, tells the whole story. It did not come about from the Iraqis. In fact, the Iraqi parliament did not even see it until February of this year, 7 months after it was shown to the major oil companies, 5 months after it was shown to the International Monetary Fund. In fact, the U.S. consultancy firm Bearing Point, whose Washington, D.C. office is just in the shadows of the Capitol, less than a mile from here, received a $250 million contract in early 2003 to advise the Iraqi oil ministry in drawing up a new hydrocarbon law. In fact, a Bearing Point employee headquartered in the Green Zone, Ronald Jonkers, who's a lawyer from Washington, D.C., was hired to do just that and act as a shepherd for the oil law. In early 2003, Bearing Point issued a report titled Options for a Sustainable Iraqi Oil Industry, which is a 323-page plan to seize control of Iraq's oil. The cover of the report contains a State Department seal and Bearing Point's name, and was developed in Houston with oil industry experts. I repeat, it was not written by, nor is it in the interest of, the Iraqi people. Today I'd like to bring you the voice of the Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions and the broader Iraqi labor movement, a voice seldom heard in the United States. Yes, indeed, there are unions in Iraq, and they are playing a major role in creating a stable, peaceful, non-sectarian future for Iraqis against great odds. Early this year, the 23,000 member strong Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions held a conference on the threatened privatization of the oil industry. The union's president, Hassan Jumaa, in his passionate address to 200 delegates attending the conference, said, among the objectives America wishes to achieve from the military occupation of Iraq, I wish simply to emphasize one central objective of the American political leaders who crossed oceans and wasted billions of dollars. That is Iraq oil. Indeed, we in the Federation of Oil Unions consider this the most important reason for this foul war. He declared, if those calling for production sharing agreements insist on acting against the will of Iraqis, we say to them that history will not forgive those who play recklessly with the wealth and destiny of a people, and that the curse of heaven and the fury of Iraqis will not leave them. We strongly warn all the foreign companies and foreign capital in the form of American companies against coming into our lands under the guise of production sharing agreements. He added, "We do not oppose the introduction of new technology into the oil sector so as to increase production. We believe in that. But this must be done in a way that will safeguard the stature of the Iraqi state and its sovereignty over natural resources." In December of 2006, 5 major Iraqi labor federations, including the Federation of Oil Unions, met in Amman, Jordan, and issued a declaration unanimously, and I will read an excerpt from it. "Iraqi public opinion strongly opposes the handing of authority and control over the oil to foreign companies that aim to make big profits at the expense of the people. They aim to rob Iraq's national wealth by virtue of unfair, long-term contracts that undermine the sovereignty of the state and the dignity of the Iraqi people. U.S. Labor Against the War calls on every member of Congress to act in stewardship with the Iraqi people and their future by ensuring that no provisions in any bill or legislation be tied to the adoption of a hydrocarbon law in Iraq. The more than 150 unions, labor councils, and state federations and other labor organizations affiliated with U.S. Labor Against the War stand with our brothers and sisters in Iraq's embattled labor movement. We ask Congress to stand with us today in opposing the scheme that undermines Iraqi national sovereignty and deprives the Iraqis of the revenue that they need and the full benefit of their natural resources so desperately needed to rebuild the country that we have destroyed. Finally, I just want to say that the first week of June, you will have an opportunity to hear directly from a representative of the Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions who will be touring the United States and going to 12 cities, along with the president of the Electricity Workers Union of Iraq. And they will be in the United States for the entire month of June, and that's a voice that we need to hear. We so seldom hear, and I hope that you will avail yourself of that opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're now open for any questions you may have. Yes, sir.
What reaction have you gotten from members of the Progressive and Iraq caucus to your position here? Basically, I suppose that Congress is helping the administration railroad this kind of...
Well, I want it made a matter of record that I have brought this issue up 4 times in the Democratic caucus. I have, yesterday, I personally delivered to over 100 members of Congress copies of the analysis that I did that was documented, based, relating to this privatization scheme that this administration developed even prior to the invasion of Iraq. So members of Congress are going to have a great deal of difficulty as we move forward to say that, well, they didn't know. This has been brought up over and over and over. And so I have been talking to members. We'll continue to do that this afternoon. This is a pivotal point in the war. If our government is permitted to put pressure on the people of Iraq to privatize their oil, the war will never end. And I believe that when you look at the track that these plans started before the war, and that the war has been proven to have been based on lies, that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 or Al-Qaeda's role in 9/11, then you get to the real possibility that this war was about oil all along. And I believe that's a basis for war crimes. And so this is a very serious moment in this country's history. And we have to look at what's going on here and take it with the utmost seriousness. And I'm grateful for the people who are in the media who are here, because this has largely escaped the notice of the media in Washington, except for a few publications. I think that it is so vast in its implications that people have trouble grasping that this could actually be going on, that we actually could have prosecuted a war for oil.
Let me follow up quickly. Is this a defeat, the legislation that's going to go through now? Defeat for the progressive?
This is a defeat for the American people. The American people elected a Congress last November to get out of Iraq, not to have a democratic version of the war, or not to have the Democrats say, well, we just don't have the votes. Hello, I want everyone to listen to this. We didn't have to offer any legislation to end the war. Once you offer legislation, that's what the president wants. The American people must know that there was no need to offer any legislation at all. Money's in the pipeline to bring the troops home. Once you offer legislation, then you fall into the trap that says, well, we have to support the troops. You could keep the war going until kingdom come under the assumption that funding the war supports the troops. But the fact of the matter is, if you really support the troops, you get them out of there. So, you know, it is an absurdity beyond belief that we could say that we're supporting our troops by keeping this war going.
Yes. The first thing I would like to say is that there is absolutely no debate about the technical meaning of the Iraq oil law, of the hydrocarbon law. I have debated the head of the International Tax and Investment Center, which is a corporate, a representative of the largest oil companies in the world, Chevron, Exxon, et cetera, sit on the board of directors. And the ITIC explains itself as the institution that has participated significantly in helping to draft this law and a strong supporter of this law. And they argue quite frankly that this law in Iraq is a U.S. construction that they have helped participate in. And they say it point blank. They're very proud of the fact. He and I do not disagree one iota about the impact of the law, what it says, what it means. When I published an op-ed in the New York Times, there was not a single letter challenging my analysis of the law, that it transforms Iraq from a nationalized to a privatized model. But in fact, there were several letters written in support of my analysis and asking the New York Times why there wasn't more news coverage as opposed to simply opinion coverage of the law. Of course, the media has consistently reported this story as a revenue sharing plan for Iraqi oil. There are, in the current law, about 3 sentences about revenue sharing, but the most important point is that the revenue sharing component of the law, the 40-page law, remember, requires first a change to the Iraqi constitution, and then secondly, an additional appendix. This law is about revenue. It is about shifting Iraqi oil revenue from Iraq to foreign multinational ownership. And there is no, I repeat, no disagreement on that fact. And that is why it is shocking that we are in a debate not about whether this is correct, about whether the United States should, in fact, be requiring that Iraq make this transformation, but rather the motivations for doing so. Let's talk about the law. Let's talk about what it does. Let's talk about if the United States should be forcing the Iraqis to pass it, and what it in fact is and what it in fact means. Thank you.
Did you have anything you want to add? Okay. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to ask, how do you think the Democratic Party will survive, given the fact that now that they've backed off of the timetable to get out of Iraq, plus in terms of impeachment on Cheney? Why do you think there is an actual backing off of that front?
Democrats took control of the House and the Senate in November based on public opposition to the war. Before the election, we had conference calls with our leaders, and we were told that the election in 2006 was about 3 things: Iraq, Iraq, Iraq. That's what we were told. Members of Congress were told that. The American people were told that. Here we are on the eve of a moment when the Democrats will be responsible for keeping the war going into autumn and essentially We have to understand what's happening here. We're laying the groundwork for the continuation of the war through the end of President Bush's term. Now, people did not vote Democratic for that purpose. We have the ability, even at this late moment, to say we're not going to offer any bill at all. And so this is a very damaging matter for our Democratic Party. Now, I've stood up and challenged this every step of the way. I've warned my Democratic colleagues that we're reneging on a promise we made to the American people. I've pointed out another path that we could take, embodied in H.R. 1234. I went to the caucus 4 times in raising the questions that Ms. Juhasz has stated here, and chapter and verse, handing out information, analyses, twice, not once, 4 times before the caucus, twice on the floor of the House. I can show you my checklist. I talked to hundreds of members. And so I think that this is a moment of truth for the Democratic Party. This is a moment of truth.
What do you think stops the Democratic Party actually moving here? Do you think Rohan has a
Listen, I don't want to speculate except to say that I'm very disappointed. And, you know, in addition to being an active member of the Democratic caucus, I also happen to be a candidate for President of the United States. This is an issue in the presidential race as well, because no one can say that they're for peace and keep voting for war. No one can say that they're for peace and vote for a resolution which creates the context for handing over the oil of Iraq to the multinational oil companies, which will keep the war going forever. No one can say they're for peace and let the American troops stay there with this private army stay there, keeping the war going forever. This is an important moment in the history of this country, and that's why I have been relentless in advancing this, and that's why to have U.S. Labor Against the Law present, to have Antonia Juhasz here, both of whom have spoken out on this. Antonia Juhasz has written extensively about these issues. Listen, what I presented on the floor of the House yesterday for 1 hour, something that hasn't happened in years in this House, was not my opinion, it was documentation. This isn't something that we think he said. No, there is documented proof that what is going on here is an attempt to force the government of Iraq to give up control of its oil to multinational oil interests at a time when the U.S. is occupying the country. This is theft. You can't call it anything else. It is theft. And we have an obligation as Americans to stand for high ideals. This doesn't represent who we are as Americans. This doesn't represent the high ideals of this country. This doesn't represent truth and justice and all the things we believe in as Americans. This represents a dark side of this government, a side that needs to be exposed to the kind of sunlight which we have on this day. And thank you very much for being here. Thank you.